The most expensive mistake anyone can make is believing an old piece of paper has no power. That was the last thing I said before I slid a weathered cardboard tube across the polished oak table in county court. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the soft scrape of the judge's reading glasses as he picked them up. Across from me, Melissa Grant, president of Silver Pine HOA, leaned back with the kind of smile that only comes from someone who believes victory has already been paid for, signed, and celebrated. Her attorneys barely looked at the tube. Outside those courthouse windows, 27 luxury vacation cabins sat beneath towering ponderosa pines, each one finished with cedar siding, stone fireplaces, wraparound porches, and picture windows overlooking the valley my grandfather had once called the prettiest place in western Montana. Families had already booked weekend stays. Investors had toasted champagne under string lights only 3 nights earlier. Realtors had called it the hottest mountain destination within 100 miles. Melissa probably thought she was about to leave court with one final signature protecting every dollar they had poured into that development. She had no idea every cabin standing out there had become the most expensive legal problem her association would ever face. The clerk carefully untied the faded cotton string around the tube, and I caught the faint smell of old paper drifting across the courtroom. It smelled exactly like my grandfather's attic, like dry pine boards, yellowed maps, and summers that never seemed to end. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It had done that months ago when I first saw bulldozers carving roads through the forest where I learned to fish. It had done that when chainsaws echoed through trees my grandfather planted with his own hands. It had done that when an HOA security guard calmly informed me I was trespassing on land my family had owned since 1951. By today, all the anger had settled into something much quieter. Patience. The kind that only comes from knowing the truth doesn't expire just because people stop believing it. The judge slowly pulled a folded document from the tube. Thick. Parchment. County seal. Original signatures. I watched Melissa glance toward her lawyer for the first time all morning. His confidence faded just enough for me to notice. That tiny crack was the first domino. You see, people always ask why I let them finish all 27 cabins. Why I never rushed into court with emergency motions. Why I stood on the ridge and watched concrete trucks, roofing crews, electricians, landscapers, and furniture deliveries roll across land that legally belonged to me. The answer was simple. Every nail they drove, every porch they built, every closing contract they signed made the truth far more valuable than it had been the day they crossed my property line. They thought silence meant surrender. They mistook patience for weakness. They believed history could be erased by fresh asphalt and glossy brochures. They never stopped to wonder why the man they kept trying to push away never looked frightened. They only saw an aging cabin hidden among the trees and a quiet engineer who rarely raised his voice. They never saw what had been waiting inside an old cardboard tube for more than 70 years. And the moment that seal touched the courtroom light, everything they thought they owned began slipping away. My name is Nathan Cole, and if you drove past my family land 10 years ago, you probably would not have noticed anything special. There was no grand entrance, no luxury lodge, no polished sign pointing tourists towards scenic cabins. Just 43 acres of quiet timber, a narrow creek that wandered through granite outcroppings, and a weathered log cabin sitting beneath towering ponderosa pines. To most people, it looked forgotten. To me, it looked exactly the way it was supposed to. My grandfather, Samuel Cole, bought the property in 1951 after returning from the Korean War. He paid less than $8,000 because nobody wanted steep mountain land that could barely support cattle. He used to laugh whenever someone called it worthless. He always said that land was patient. It did not need attention every day. It simply waited for the right people to appreciate it. Some of my earliest memories were made there. I can still hear the creek flowing over smooth stones while he showed me how to identify elk tracks after a fresh rain. The smell of pine sap mixed with wood smoke every evening as we sat outside the old cabin watching the last sunlight disappear behind the ridgeline. There was one rule he repeated so often I could probably recite it before I learned multiplication. Never lose the papers. He did not mean tax receipts or utility bills. He meant every survey, every deed, every handwritten note that explained where our family boundaries truly stood. He kept them rolled inside an old cardboard tube because he believed paper could outlive memory. After he passed away, I inherited not only the property, but also his habits. I became a civil engineer, spending most of my career designing mountain highways, retaining walls, and bridge foundations across the western United States. My work kept me away for months at a time. I trusted the county records, paid every property tax before the deadline, maintained insurance, and hired a local caretaker to inspect the cabin every few weeks. Nothing ever suggested trouble was coming. Every time I returned, the valley greeted me the same way. The gravel road crunched beneath my truck tires. Cold mountain air carried the scent of cedar and damp earth. Wind pushed softly through the pine branches with the steady rhythm that always reminded me why my grandfather refused to sell, even when developers offered him more money than he had ever imagined earning. That valley was never just real estate. It was our family history written into the landscape itself. Looking back now, I realize how ordinary everything seemed before Silver Pine HOA appeared over the next ridge. At first it was only survey flags, then construction trailers, then freshly graded roads winding through neighboring property. People called it progress. Local newspapers praised the investment. Realtors predicted booming property values. I even remember thinking the new development would stay on its own land and leave mine alone. It never crossed my mind that someone could look at 70 years of recorded ownership and decide it simply no longer mattered. But that was exactly the assumption Melissa Grant built her entire future upon. And by the time I understood what she believed, the first trees had already begun to disappear beyond the creek. The first time I met Melissa Grant, she smiled as if the entire valley already belonged to her. She stepped out of a white luxury sport utility vehicle wearing polished hiking boots that had probably never touched real mud before that morning. Behind her stood 2 surveyors, 3 developers, and a stack of oversized blueprints spread across the hood of a pickup truck. Fresh orange survey flags fluttered in the mountain breeze, breaking the natural colors of the forest like warning signs I did not yet understand. The smell of diesel from an idling excavator drifted through the trees, while distant backup alarms echoed across the hillside. I walked over, introduced myself, and welcomed them to the neighboring property. Melissa barely glanced at me before returning her attention to the maps. She thanked me politely, then asked an unexpected question. She wanted to know how often I actually visited my land. I answered honestly. Sometimes every month, sometimes every few months, depending on construction projects. She nodded with a smile that felt strangely rehearsed. She said it was a shame when beautiful mountain property stayed underused because progress always found a better purpose for forgotten places. At the time, I thought it was just another developer talking about growth. Looking back, I realized she had already decided what story she wanted everyone else to believe. Over the following weeks, Silver Pine HOA transformed the neighboring ridge at an astonishing pace. Dump trucks climbed the access road from sunrise until evening. Concrete mixers replaced the quiet sound of birds every morning. New utility poles appeared almost overnight. Local business owners celebrated because construction crews filled diners, hardware stores, and gas stations. Newspaper headlines praised the project as an economic boost for the county. Melissa became something of a local celebrity. She attended town meetings, donated to community events, and spoke confidently about creating a destination that would attract visitors from across the country. Whenever reporters asked about preserving the character of the valley, she always gave the same reassuring answer. She claimed they respected history while building for the future. Those words sounded comforting until I noticed one small detail that refused to leave my mind. The new survey stakes kept moving. Every time I drove up to check the cabin, another line of bright markers seemed closer to my side of the creek. At first I assumed I was remembering the terrain incorrectly. Mountain landscapes can play tricks on your eyes, especially when trees disappear and open ground changes familiar landmarks. Still, something felt wrong. One afternoon, I found an old granite boundary marker half buried beneath loose soil. My grandfather had shown it to me decades earlier, explaining that survey monuments mattered more than fences because stone rarely lied. Now that marker sat several yards outside the freshly painted construction line. When I mentioned it to one of the surveyors, he avoided eye contact and quietly told me he was only following the approved site plan. Melissa arrived a few minutes later, cheerful as ever. She assured me modern satellite mapping was far more accurate than old property markers placed generations ago. She even laughed, and said technology had finally caught up with history. Her confidence never slipped for a second. She spoke as though every question already had an answer and every disagreement had already been settled. I stood there listening to the wind rustle through the remaining pine trees, watching another excavator crawl farther toward the creek, and for the first time in my life, my grandfather's valley no longer felt completely safe. The real invasion did not begin with lawyers or official notices. It began with ordinary sounds that slowly replaced every memory I had of that valley. The steady rush of the creek disappeared beneath the rumble of heavy equipment. Birds that had nested near the old cabin every spring simply stopped returning. The scent of pine needles after a morning rain gave way to fresh asphalt, diesel exhaust, and sawdust hanging in the mountain air. Every visit revealed another piece of my family's history quietly erased by machines that never questioned where they had been told to work. At first, the clearing stayed close to the neighboring ridge, but before long new access roads crossed terrain I knew by heart. I walked one of those roads early one morning carrying nothing but a camera and a notebook. The gravel was still loose under my boots, and tire tracks from concrete trucks stretched toward the creek. I recognized boulders my grandfather had used as reference points while teaching me the property lines, yet now they sat beside bright construction fencing as though they had always belonged to someone else. I stopped one of the foremen and politely asked to see the current site plan. He unfolded a laminated map and pointed directly across land that I knew was mine. According to that drawing, my cabin, my creek, and nearly half the meadow had somehow become part of Silver Pine's expansion area. I explained that there had to be a mistake. He shrugged with genuine sympathy and said he was simply building where the approved survey directed him. Before I could say anything else, Melissa arrived in another spotless sport utility vehicle, greeting contractors by name while discussing delivery schedules and landscaping plans. She looked at me with the same calm confidence she always carried and assured me the county had already accepted the revised boundaries. She encouraged me not to worry because modern records were far more reliable than family stories passed down through generations. Then she handed me a neatly printed brochure showing artist renderings of luxury cabins standing exactly where my grandfather once taught me how to skip stones across the creek. A week later, the first foundation appeared, then another. Framing crews worked with remarkable speed, raising walls that caught the afternoon sunlight where open meadow had existed only days before. Delivery trucks arrived with stacks of cedar beams, windows, roofing materials, and stone veneer. Every evening, the development grew larger. Every morning, another section of forest disappeared behind fresh construction fencing. I contacted the county assessor's office, expecting someone to immediately recognize the obvious error, but the employee I spoke with could only tell me that the submitted survey matched the documents currently on file. I drove home carrying more questions than answers. 2 days later, I found an envelope taped to the front door of my cabin. Inside was a formal notice from Silver Pine Homeowners Association informing me that I had entered restricted community property without authorization during my previous visit. The letter politely warned that future unauthorized access could result in civil enforcement. I read it twice before looking out the cabin window toward the creek. It was one of the strangest moments of my life. I was standing inside a home my grandfather had built with his own hands, holding a document that claimed I did not belong there. Instead of feeling angry, I felt something far more dangerous. I realized someone had rewritten reality on paper, and almost everyone around me had already accepted the new version as the truth. For the first time since inheriting the property, I started wondering if everyone else was right and I was wrong. I hired a local real estate attorney, carrying every tax receipt, every insurance statement, and copies of the county records I had downloaded online. He spent nearly 2 hours comparing maps before finally leaning back in his chair with a tired expression that told me everything before he even spoke. The digital records were inconsistent. Older surveys had been scanned decades earlier, and some boundary notes were nearly impossible to read. Newer mapping systems appeared to support the development's claims. He did not tell me I had no case, but he did say proving ownership would be difficult without stronger evidence. I drove back to the valley that afternoon with the windows down, hoping the familiar mountain air would somehow clear my thoughts. Instead, I heard nail guns echoing across the hillside where another row of cabins had already taken shape. Fresh cedar lumber filled the air with a sweet scent that almost reminded me of the old cabin until the smell mixed with wet concrete and diesel fuel. Construction crews moved with incredible efficiency. Roofs appeared within days. Stone masons installed elegant fireplaces. Landscapers unloaded young pine trees that looked strangely artificial beside the mature forest surrounding them. It was as if someone had decided to manufacture a version of the mountain instead of appreciating the one that already existed. Every week brought another announcement from Silver Pine. Reservations opened. Model cabins welcomed prospective buyers. Promotional videos showed families enjoying sunsets over what they proudly described as exclusive community property. I watched one advertisement online and nearly laughed when I recognized the creek flowing behind smiling vacationers. That creek had carried my toy fishing boat when I was 8 years old. Now strangers admired it as though it had always belonged to the resort. Friends called with well-meaning advice. Some suggested accepting a settlement if one was offered. Others believed fighting a successful homeowners association backed by developers would only drain my savings. Even the county employee I spoke with sounded sympathetic, but reminded me that official records favored the current survey. The more people repeated those words, the heavier they became. Official records. Modern survey. Approved boundaries. It was amazing how quickly a document could reshape public opinion. One evening I walked through my grandfather's cabin after sunset, listening to old floorboards creak beneath my boots. Everything inside looked exactly as he had left it years earlier. His lantern still hung beside the stone fireplace. An old enamel coffee pot rested on the shelf above the wood stove. Family photographs lined the wall, their edges faded from decades of mountain sunlight. I found myself staring at one picture of my grandfather standing beside a granite boundary marker with one hand resting on a survey tripod. On the back, written in careful handwriting, he had added a simple sentence. Never trust memory when paper exists. I turned the photograph over several times, thinking about those words long after darkness settled outside. The attorney believed the digital records created too much uncertainty. Melissa believed technology had erased the past. Everyone else seemed convinced that the story had already reached its ending. But my grandfather had spent his entire life preparing for the possibility that someday someone would forget where the truth actually began. Sitting alone in that silent cabin, surrounded by decades of ordinary objects most people would consider worthless, I suddenly realized I had been searching in all the wrong places. If the answer still existed, it probably was not waiting inside a courthouse or county office. It was waiting exactly where he always expected our family to look. The next morning, I unlocked the attic door for the first time in nearly 6 years. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight slipping between the old wooden boards, and the familiar smell of dry pine, aged paper, and cedar chests instantly carried me back to childhood summers. My grandfather never believed in throwing anything away if it told part of the family's story. Shelves overflowed with fishing gear, handwritten journals, rusted surveying tools, and neatly labeled wooden boxes dating back decades. I spent hours opening one container after another, carefully reading faded notes and unfolding brittle maps that described fence repairs, timber harvests, and creek measurements from long before I was born. By late afternoon, I had found plenty of memories, but nothing that could stop 27 cabins from standing on my land. I was about to give up when I noticed an old workbench pushed against the far wall. Beneath it sat a weathered cardboard tube covered with a thin layer of dust so untouched that even the spiders had built around it instead of across it. My grandfather always stored rolled surveys inside cardboard tubes, but I had assumed every important document had already been moved into filing cabinets years earlier. I picked it up, and for the first time since this nightmare began, my hands actually trembled. The faded cotton string wrapped around the tube was tied with the exact same knot he used on everything he wanted preserved. As I loosened it, the smell of old parchment escaped into the quiet attic. Inside rested several rolled documents protected by waxed paper. The first was the original warranty deed recorded in 1951, complete with embossed county seal, handwritten signatures, and the original legal description that listed every bearing and distance across the property. Beneath it lay the original field survey completed by a licensed surveyor whose detailed notes referenced granite monuments, creek bends, and iron pins that modern satellite maps had completely ignored. Then came something I never expected to find. My grandfather had kept the surveyor's handwritten field notebook. Every measurement was documented in pencil with compass bearings, elevation changes, weather conditions, and sketches explaining why each permanent marker had been placed exactly where it was. Folded inside the final page was a letter from the county survey office acknowledging receipt of the completed boundary verification shortly after the property purchase. It was signed, dated, stamped, and preserved as carefully as every other document in the tube. I spread everything across the old workbench and compared the descriptions with photographs I had taken of the surviving granite monument near the creek. Every angle matched, every distance aligned. Every forgotten stone still sat exactly where it had more than 70 years earlier. Suddenly, every confusing digital map, every blurry scanned record, and every confident statement from Melissa lost its certainty. Technology had not corrected history. It had simply overlooked it. I carefully rolled every document back into the same tube, tied the cotton string exactly as I had found it, and carried it downstairs as though it were made of glass. For the first time since Silver Pine crossed onto my family's land, I no longer wondered whether I could prove the truth. I knew I could. The only question left was when I should reveal it. Standing on the cabin porch that evening, I watched another delivery truck disappear into the construction site as fresh lumber arrived for buildings that were still unfinished. Instead of calling my attorney that night, I quietly smiled because I had finally realized that timing could become just as powerful as evidence. Most people think winning a legal case is about acting fast. My grandfather believed the opposite. He used to tell me that timing was part of the truth because revealing the right evidence at the wrong moment could still lead to the wrong outcome. Standing on the porch with that old cardboard tube in my hands, I finally understood what he meant. The next morning I met with a new attorney, someone who specialized in complex property disputes instead of ordinary real estate transactions. I laid every document across his conference table, beginning with the original deed, then the field survey, the handwritten notebook, and finally the county verification letter. He examined each page slowly, occasionally adjusting his glasses before comparing one document against another. Nearly an hour passed before he looked up. His first words were simple. "Nathan, if these documents are authenticated, the land is yours." Then he surprised me with a question I had not expected. "Has construction been completed?" I told him the answer was no. The roads were nearly finished. Most of the cabins already had roofs, and landscaping crews were still planting trees around the entrance. He remained silent for several seconds before explaining something that completely changed the way I viewed the situation. If we immediately sought an emergency injunction, construction would stop. Financial losses would remain relatively limited. But if Silver Pine continued investing millions of dollars into permanent improvements while believing they owned the property, the legal consequences would become dramatically larger once ownership was established. He made it clear that every decision had to remain lawful. We would not interfere with construction. We would not mislead anyone. We would simply preserve the evidence, complete our own independent survey, and prepare the strongest case possible while the development followed its own timeline. That strategy demanded something far more difficult than anger. It demanded patience. Over the following months, I visited the valley regularly, never stepping beyond the areas I knew remained unquestionably outside the active construction zone. I photographed progress from public access points. One week, I counted freshly paved roads winding between completed cabins. The next visit brought decorative streetlights, stone entrance signs, and rows of newly planted evergreens. Soon moving trucks delivered furniture, appliances, and outdoor seating. The sound of nail guns slowly disappeared, replaced by landscapers trimming shrubs and maintenance crews pressure washing sidewalks before grand opening events. Melissa appeared happier than ever. Local newspapers praised the project as a remarkable success. Social media filled with photographs of families relaxing on cedar porches overlooking the mountains. Reservation calendars showed weekends booking months in advance. Every smiling photograph represented another investment anchored to ground that had never legally belonged to the development. Occasionally, I caught sight of Melissa greeting guests near the clubhouse with the same confident smile she wore the day we first met. She looked completely certain that history had been rewritten in her favor. Meanwhile, my attorney quietly assembled certified copies, expert reports, title research, and a modern survey that followed every bearing recorded inside my grandfather's original notebook. Piece by piece, our case became impossible to ignore. I never celebrated. I never confronted anyone. I simply watched the valley transform while protecting the one thing no amount of construction could replace. The truth remained rolled inside that weathered cardboard tube, waiting for the exact moment when 27 finished cabins would become 27 undeniable pieces of evidence. By the morning of the hearing, the cardboard tube looked almost ordinary again. The dust had been carefully brushed away, but the worn edges, faded paper label, and cotton string remained exactly as my grandfather had left them decades earlier. My attorney carried a polished leather briefcase filled with certified surveys, title reports, expert affidavits, and legal filings. Yet somehow the oldest item in the room still felt like the most important. Melissa entered the courtroom surrounded by attorneys, board members, and consultants. They greeted one another with quiet confidence, exchanging smiles that suggested they expected another routine victory. After all, they had county records, approved permits, completed construction, and months of successful business behind them. From their perspective, everything had already been settled long before anyone entered the courtroom. The hearing began with technical arguments about surveys, digital mapping systems, and recorded boundary updates. Melissa's legal team confidently displayed modern satellite images and enlarged property maps on courtroom monitors. They spoke about efficiency, updated technology, and official databases. Their presentation was polished, organized, and persuasive. Then our attorney stood and requested permission to introduce one final exhibit into evidence. He placed the weathered cardboard tube on the evidence table without saying another word. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. The clerk untied the faded cotton string with surprising care before handing the rolled documents to the judge. The parchment unfolded with a soft crackle that echoed through the silent room. The embossed county seal remained perfectly visible despite its age. The judge examined the signatures, then compared them with certified archival records already submitted by the county historian. A title expert testified that the deed had remained in the uninterrupted chain of ownership since 1951. Next came the original field notebook. Every handwritten compass bearing matched permanent granite monuments that our independent survey team had physically located on the property only weeks earlier. Large photographs appeared on the courtroom screen showing those same weathered stone markers still standing beside the creek exactly where the original surveyor had documented them more than 70 years before. One by one, every measurement aligned. Every distance matched. Every overlooked detail connected like pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting patiently for someone to assemble them correctly. I glanced toward Melissa. The confidence that had defined her for months slowly disappeared. She whispered something to one of her attorneys, who immediately began reviewing documents. With growing urgency, their modern survey depended on assumptions created from incomplete digital records. Ours rested on original legal documents, preserved monuments, verified historical evidence, and an unbroken chain of title. The difference became impossible to ignore. After a brief recess, the judge returned with a written ruling that seemed to unfold almost as quietly as the old deed itself. The court determined that the original boundary descriptions controlled ownership because they were properly recorded, continuously preserved, and conclusively supported by both historical and present-day physical evidence. The independent survey confirmed that the completed cabins, internal roads, clubhouse, utility improvements, and associated structures had been constructed on property legally belonging to me. The courtroom remained silent as those words settled over everyone present. Months of confidence, millions of dollars in improvements, and countless assumptions about modern records all gave way to the simple authority of documents my grandfather had protected inside an old cardboard tube. In less than 30 minutes, the story everyone believed about that mountain valley changed completely. Not because anyone shouted louder, but because the truth had finally been unfolded for everyone to see. Several months after the court entered its final orders, I drove through the same entrance where Silver Pine had once welcomed visitors with polished stone signs and glossy advertisements. The signs were different now. The aggressive branding had disappeared, replaced by a simple wooden marker carved with 4 words that meant far more to my family than any luxury marketing campaign ever could. Coal Creek Preserve. Every time I passed beneath it, I could still hear my grandfather's voice reminding me that land did not belong to the loudest person. It belonged to the one who never abandoned the truth. The valley felt peaceful again. Morning sunlight reflected across the creek exactly as it had when I was a child. The towering ponderosa pines still filled the air with their familiar scent, and the evening breeze carried the same quiet rustling through the branches that had welcomed generations of my family. The cabins remained, but their purpose had changed. Rather than becoming an exclusive community controlled by a homeowners association, they became a place where families could experience the mountains with respect for the land beneath their feet. We preserved hiking trails instead of expanding roads. We restored native vegetation around the creek. Informational signs explained the history of the valley instead of pretending it had begun with a development proposal. One cabin became something especially meaningful to me. Inside, framed beneath carefully protected glass, rested the original deed, the handwritten survey notebook, and copies of the photographs showing the granite monuments that had survived every passing decade. Visitors often stopped to study those documents. Many seemed surprised that ordinary papers, carefully preserved by one determined family, could carry more authority than the newest technology when the facts were properly documented. I never displayed them as trophies. I displayed them as reminders. Melissa eventually moved on from the valley, and the legal disputes surrounding the failed project became lessons discussed in real estate seminars throughout the region. I never celebrated her disappointment because that was never the point. My grandfather taught me that revenge fades quickly, but justice has a way of lasting because it restores what should never have been taken in the first place. Looking back, I understand why so many people believed I had waited too long. They measured success by speed. They assumed the first person to build, advertise, and collect reservations would automatically become the rightful owner. They never realized that ownership begins long before construction and survives long after headlines disappear. Every photograph taken beside those cabins now captures something more important than beautiful scenery. It captures a valley where patience defeated assumption and where history quietly reclaimed its place. Sometimes I still sit on the porch of the original log cabin as the sun slips behind the mountains, listening to the creek and breathing the cool evening air exactly as I did with my grandfather years ago. The cardboard tube rests safely inside, no longer hidden in the attic, but never far from reach. I doubt it will ever need to enter another courtroom, yet I keep it close for the same reason he did. The truth deserves to be preserved, even when nobody thinks they will ever need it. I learned that justice rarely arrives with flashing lights or dramatic speeches. More often, it arrives quietly, carried by patience, protected by evidence, and remembered by those who refuse to let the past be erased. And in the end, the oldest piece of paper in the room proved to be the strongest foundation anyone could ever build upon.